Well, welcome to the AI Summit New York this December at the end of 2020. Perhaps one of the last, hopefully one of the last virtual conferences that we will all be attending. We hope to see people in New York City next year. For now, however, we are going to continue online as we are all accustomed. And the talk today that we have is one of the longer titles I've seen in one of these talks, so I'm going to be forced to just read it to you. I can't remember all of these words. We are in the digital ethics and AI governance section, and we are talking about what practical measures do organizations and institutions need to be taking to ensure responsible and sustainable AI implementation. And I am joined by David, Branka, and Sean. And what I thought we would do to begin is have each of us present a few thoughts about who we are and how we ended up at this point in time discussing AI ethics with all of you. I will lead by example, so I will go first. I am James Brusseau, a philosophy professor. I'm interested in the history of philosophy and ethics, and I guided myself into AI ethics and sustainable AI sustainability and responsibility, studying with some questions about predictive analytics and how we define who we are in the world, how we create our own identity, how that might change if we no longer are forced to fight to choose one thing or another, but are instead immediately given everything before perhaps we even know that we want it. So what do those kinds of questions have to do with personal identity? And then I was also interested in knowledge formation, that is specifically the difference between knowledge that is constructed in human terms through causality and linear reasoning, and how that is distinct from knowledge that is formed through correspondence and pattern recognition in the way AI constructs I wouldn't call them understandings of the world, but representations of the world. So that leads into the important AI ethical debate about explainability and whether we can actually understand how artificial intelligence mechanisms work. So I am James Brusseau, and that's my way into this topic. David, where are you coming from?
Yes, hello. My name is David Barnes. I am also a professor of philosophy, a deputy head of the English and Philosophy Department at United States Military Academy at West Point. I also have another hat, and I am the United States Army's Chief AI Ethics Officer. And in that role, helping the Army craft responsible AI ethics policy, as well as internally looking at how to operationalize the newly adopted DoD AI ethics principles. The way I fell into this research area, it's been my dual interest in technology and philosophy. I teach a course in cyber ethics as well as AI ethics. And then I was working with DARPA on a program called URSA, Urban Reconnaissance Through Supervised Autonomy. What is unique about this project, and the same work as I'm extending into the Army writ large, is we brought in a panel of subject matter experts, legal, philosophy, practitioners, data scientists, to help advise the performers from the very beginning. In other words, much like a weapons system goes through a legal review, Article 36 review before it gets fielded, is there a way, whether we're talking about a weapons system or talking about a back office AI application, where we could introduce discussions, risk analysis of ethics, law, policy, and society considerations throughout the whole AI lifecycle. So I will leave it at that. So thank you.
Right. Well, it's a beautiful campus up there in West Point. If we were in New York City sitting around a table, I would recommend to the audience, if they were visiting from out of state, to maybe take a road trip up to see the Hudson River from those heights. I've been up there on the weekend to see a football game with my family once or twice. It is open to the public, is it not, pretty much all the time?
It is, but we have the restrictions because of COVID right now,
course.
and so the football games are just the students, the cadets, and the support staff and the football teams right now. So we are very much, as everyone in this panel, looking forward to the days when we have more freedom of movement and be able to enjoy each other in the sites together.
There you go. Branka, where are you coming from?
Hi, James. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, David, for your introduction as well. First, I have to say it's a pleasure to be joined by two philosophers. This is the first critique that I often hear with organizing AI ethics panels, that we don't have enough philosophers joining the discussion. So it's really a pleasure to join this panel. Yes, I'm Branka. I'm originally from Serbia, from Southeast Europe, and I currently live in California, in Bay Area, where I founded an organization called AI for Peace. I'm executive director at AI for Peace, think tank working at the intersection of AI and peace, human rights, democracy, and sustainable development. And I'm also a non-resident fellow at the New York University at the Center on International Cooperation. So I'm also looking forward to having this pandemic stop and come to New York and join the team there. As a fellow at NYU, I'm researching data-driven approaches to peace building and conflict prevention. So I'm coming to this field of AI basically as a peace builder. So I worked for more than 12 years in reconciliation and peace building. I was researching the power of new technologies and how we can utilize them in a positive way to contribute to more peaceful societies. So my broader focus is on researching the benefits, risks, and ethical implications of exponential technologies, including AI. So work, I'm combining this, what we call data-centric, but also human-centric approach to solving some of the biggest global challenges, and particularly creating peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. I have to say that I'm joining this panel to shed maybe more light to this human-centered AI approaches with special emphasis on vulnerable populations, on individuals and groups that are often on margins of our societies and that often maybe don't have the place at the table. So I am coming to this topic from this diversity and inclusion dimension and perspective as well. And maybe just one sentence about AI for Peace. So we are exploring this human component of data and AI, and we study ethical and social dimensions of using big data, not only to carry different tasks, as I said, but to try to use AI as a helping hand to solve some of the world's biggest challenges. It's my pleasure to be here once again.
It's an ambitious project. It's good to have those. Sean, what is your route to this mess we call AI ethics?
Sure. My name is Sean Perryman, and I serve as Director of Social Impact Policy and Counsel at the Internet Association. My path to here was I was counsel on the House Oversight Committee, worked with Congressman Elijah Cummings, but I got tasked with managing our IT subcommittee, so overseeing the agencies and the different emerging technology coming out of government agencies, as well as the modernization of government agencies. During that time, there was a lot of talk about AI and trying to understand exactly how our government was using it, because even for members of Congress, in a lot of ways, they were unaware of some of the implementation of this technology. So when I got involved in that, and I saw the opportunity at the Internet Association to deal with this sort of from a diversity and inclusion angle. They're looking for someone that deals with D&I policy. And so much of this is, as was mentioned, is dealing with groups that are marginalized and underrepresented. and the historically biased data that goes into algorithms and artificial intelligence. So that's sort of my perspective on it. Outside of work, I was actually the president of the largest NAACP chapter in Virginia. So I've also looked at it from a civil rights perspective as well. And now I'm a candidate for lieutenant governor here in Virginia, and it's part of my platform. So, so I've taken most of my experience with this has been from a policy perspective and looking at how can government allow for innovation and allow this technology to flourish while doing so responsibly and ethically.
Right. So, well, it looks like none of us can vote for you because we are all out of state, but we would do the best we could otherwise. So, it's an interesting group. I thought that, sir, to begin, it seems to me that the most important question, and this comes to my mind. I'm thinking now of the. We remember a few months ago that Google accumulated an ethics board to try to understand or place an ethical filter on what was going on in the company. And they brought in, I'm not sure, 6 or 12 people or something, and they were all virtue signalers. So their definition of ethics was, I think this way and everyone else has to agree with me. And then the result of that was, if you remember, that the whole thing collapsed in about a week, right? So that there is this fundamental problem that a lot of people are in favor of AI ethics and responsible AI, but it's not clear that we have an agreement on what counts as responsible AI. What does that term mean? How do we know if a company is responsible or not? So I thought we would start with that and sort of go around. And what I can contribute is a kind of a quick philosophical background to this. Just generally, this is, I think most of us are aware, is the following. There are two kinds of approaches to this, to AI ethics. One is a libertarian kind of approach, which maximizes individual freedom, maybe represented by a Peter Thiel. And then the other approach would be a social-based approach or a collectivist approach, which privileges social well-being. Maybe an example might be this Dorsey at Twitter, right, who would say, look, the reason that I am censoring some or other people is because I believe that serves the general welfare. Whereas by contrast, on the freedom side, you're going to say, well, no, you can't censor anybody, right? Just everybody talk. So those are the two kinds of broad approaches to AI ethics. Do we privilege the individual and freedom, or do we privilege the society and the collective well-being? And then I think that it's worth noting, just recently now, we've had the European Council's ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, which it seems to me have done a pretty good job of bringing together both of those approaches. They have some good individual values like autonomy and some good social values as well. So I think one way to begin thinking about what AI ethics is could start with that document. And we could say that in order for a company to be responsible, in order for a company to be sustainable, what they should demonstrate is a sense that they understand where they are in these debates. They understand what the debates are between that individual freedom perspective and the collectivist perspective. And they can use these guidelines, which are quite well written by the European Community Council, to define for themselves where they want to be on that ethical spectrum. Of course, the idea is not to say you have to be here or you have to be there. The idea is instead to say you need to understand where you are and be able to explain it. So that's one kind of approach to what responsible AI means. A responsible AI means understanding what your values are as a company and being able to defend those. A very philosophical approach and very theoretical, of course. David, your world is much more practical, though you're also a philosopher. What are your thoughts about what AI ethics or responsible AI means?
Absolutely, great question. And I should have added earlier a bit of a disclaimer that what I'm giving are my own opinions and may not reflect those of West Point, the Army, or the DoD. I think part of this conversation when I'm engaging with different stakeholders, whether that's in academia, whether that's in the private sector or with government, I almost have to start off with some myths about AI ethics and ethics in general, because this really informs this conversation about what direction we should head in terms when we think about responsible AI, and how we go about assigning their responsibility, and ensuring that that all the actors are acting in accordance with those principles. And the first is, many people think, and this is a myth, that these aren't ethical decisions, right? That when we're talking about AI, we're really talking about safety or it's trust only. And I want to remind people that any decision that affects people at a minimum is a values-laden one, right? So it's certainly, if we're talking about the use of AI on the battlefield, life and death decisions, but also in AI-enabled systems that works in HR, talent management. Those are ethical decisions. The second one is that AI is values neutral, right? I'll start off with a class and put up on the board real quickly, 2 + 2 = 4. And I said, what is the moral relevance of that statement, right? I mean, and again, the myth is because we're dealing with algorithms, we're dealing with the coding of mathematics, that it's values neutral. But as Branka said, it's human-centered. It's the human beings that are in the life cycle that are making the decisions in terms of optimizing code, or how to label the data, are imparting their worldview in terms of how that system is being designed and developed and trained. Another one is that we can simply code ethics or ethical rules in artificial intelligence. So setting aside a debate on which normative theory is objectively true, it's still problematic in terms of thinking of an AI system as some kind of ethical agent. And I think it's a mistake to impart that in there. Now, we can, I believe, for example, as Ron Arkin has said, ensure that protected sites, say, on the battlefield are not targeted by a system. But that's not saying that the system is acting ethically. That's imparting restrictions on that system itself. And I think the other one is this notion that AI is the solution to all of our problems. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of hyperbole, misinformation out there. We can go back and talk about the AI winter. But people are bombarded by a number of things. It's the commercials that they see on television and media with the promise of what AI brings, combined with their upbringing, reading and being informed by science fiction. We need to understand that we're talking about fragile, narrow AI systems that are going to be employed perhaps individually, but more likely as a system of those systems. And so thinking about the interoperability and the interactions with that are much more problematic and much more dynamic than people realize. So as I mentioned, the Department of Defense has adopted the DoD AI principles: responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. And I'm very fortunate to assist with the writing with the Defense Innovation Board with those principles. But those are, in a sense, our guidelines. And so you're asking really the crux of the problem is, how do we take those guiding principles that incorporate the values that we have as human beings, our desire to generate not just AI but other technologies for the good of society, and actually put them into operation. Because one of the other fears, I think, that is another myth, is that we are going to layer AI ethics compliance on top of the way that we're doing business. It's going to become burdensome. It's going to become, as Counsel talks about, AI ethics policing or ethical gates. And that's not necessarily the case. But again, there's that fear that we're creating this, that we're going to generate some sort of additional a burden that's going to detract from the desire to develop, this exciting new technology to its fullest. I think that's just that's false, and I think that beginning with those principles, we can help guide that conversation and that development.
Right. That's a terrific point, David. This idea that ethics is not necessarily a constriction, Rather, it's an opportunity. It doesn't slow innovation. In fact, it can be used to speed innovation. So thank you. I'm sorry, I interrupted someone in the, or perhaps I did not. So we have two sets of, we have the EC guidelines, sort of modified as I'm presenting them. We have the DoD guidelines. Branka, when we think about what counts as responsible AI, where do you start? What is your touchstone?
Thank you, James, and thank you, David, for raising so many important questions regarding this. But to go back first, James, to your introduction, I love this, how you put this difference between individual and collective approaches. And being a political scientist, I have to comment that I see a bit of geopolitics here as well. It really depends, what responsible AI is. It really depends from which part as well. Yes, there are certain principles that we all agreed upon, but there is definitely a different approach. And we often talk about this when we talk about data ethics. So citizens are actually put there as a priority, and their privacy and their rights, how different approaches there are in US with maybe putting companies on the first place, discussing ethics. What we see now, we often see these Western-centric approaches. I think they're much, much more out there to discuss about. But I think we are on the right direction, even having the discussions like this now, and really trying to realize what is this responsible AI. And to come back to something that David said, I would like to introduce this concept of trustworthiness that European different organizations are putting the priority on as well. And I think for organizations developing AI, so these organizations have to show today that their systems and algorithms are not only responsible, but fair, that they follow fairness and explainability, and that their AI, we hear this often, is trustworthy. So trustworthiness, I think, is really interesting in that sense that it's not a characteristic that is embedded in AI. It's more of an outcome, a result, right? An attitude we are shaping in the user once we develop AI through set of those ethical principles. And just to maybe showcase how important this relationship between trustworthiness and ethics is, I found this information on a survey that MasterCard did recently, which discovered that committing to principles for the ethical use of data would help drive trust with more than 90% of individuals. So I think this is quite a strong case to show what this connection between trust and ethical AI is. But then when we look at this, maybe from outside, from the citizen's point of view, I think ethics is more about accountability. So what is responsible AI? That would be maybe an accountable AI or an accountable company that is producing or implementing AI. So a big question, and I'm thinking for myself as well as a user, a big question is how to hold these organizations with sometimes unprecedented power over society accountable for the consequences of their AI products or decisions. And so looking into this relationship again, I think ethics are the guiding rules for the decisions we make and actions we take. And these rules reflect our core beliefs about what is right and what is fair. So this is how I see ethics. And trust, on the other hand, reflects our belief that another person or a company is reliable and has integrity and will behave in the manner we expect. So I think, again, just to try to put this in practice a bit, what ethical and responsible AI mean, I think this is not a question only to ask an organization or a certain board in the organization. I think we have to have this discussion on all levels in the organization, from having a board commitment to the ethical behavior, to the commitment of developers and data scientists. So it's not AI responsibility, it's not only responsibility of companies or of data societies. And I think policies have a huge role in this, as David mentioned. Putting all of this in the policy framework is extremely important to put principles to practice.
Very good, thank you. Okay, well, Sean, you always have the toughest role because you have to come after all the ideas have been used up. I'm sure that you have some thoughts about what counts for you as responsible AI. How do we know what is?
Sure, and we covered a lot, but I approach this not as a philosopher like so many on the call. I'm often talking to members of Congress who or just regular people, trying to get them to understand what is the ethics of AI. And when we talk about ethics, for the most part, for the common person, they're going to think right or wrong, right? And that really boils down to what is the intended use of the technology that we're talking about. So a lot of times when I'm talking in the regulatory context and we talk about the level of risk, because you don't want to regulate AI that picks the next song the same way that you regulate, let's say, a self-driving vehicle. So I think when I think about the ethics of AI, I think about what is fair of what that technology is being used for, the intention of that technology versus the expectation of the consumer, because sometimes those things do not align. So all of those things play into it. But I think from a regulatory standpoint, what I try to emphasize is that we need to talk about transparency and explainability, because for the most part, you want to be able to explain, how did this AI or algorithm reach the decision it did? Is this what I intended it to do? Is this fair in the sense that of the way we understand it? So, and this becomes more and more complicated, especially when we talk about things like facial recognition. One of the conversations we were having on the Hill is that there are, license plates, driver's license, the faces are often put into systems to run against facial recognition technology, and these could be for criminal databases. Now, you want more data for the AI in order to be able to better recognize different people of color. You need more and more public data. But at the same time, without informing the public, do you have their consent to use that driver's license photo in that way? So these are some of the conversations that we get into when we talk about ethical AI, in the sense that we want to build a technology that's more fair and works better for everyone, but at the same time have that consent in where we're getting the data from. So these are all conversations that go on. But for me, when I talk about ethical AI, it really depends on the context and the risk of the technology. And then often it boils down to, can we explain why the system did what it did in a way that makes sense to people, that they would say, yes, this is what I expected, and this seems fair to me.
Sounds good. So we have expectations, we have trustworthiness, we have the DoD, and we have the EC Counsel kind of as a background for what counts as responsible AI. And I think we can now launch into the fundamental question. The question that brought everybody here is, well, what is to be done? What should we do about this? And the position that I'm going to defend very quickly is that one way to talk about how we can implement responsibility is through investors. That is, the money directs things. And so what I propose is something called AI Human Impact, which is an investment fund or theory in which companies are graded or rated in terms of their ethical performance. Just like a company can be graded or rated in terms of its financial performance, so too we could draw up an ethical report specifically about AI intensive companies and say, look, how does this company do in terms of privacy? How does this company do in terms of fairness? How does this company do in terms of accountability? And stack that report up next to the financial measures and make this available to investors. Now, as it turns out, companies that use non-financial criteria, or excuse me, investors that use non-financial criteria to grade companies do, it appears, in the medium and long term fare better than those that use only financial criteria. So there may be some hope for the idea that making AI ethics clear for investors and grading companies in that way, as AI Human Impact proposes, may in fact both help people do well and do good. So one approach to implementing responsible AI is to say, let's let investors with their free choices help, in a certain sense, guide companies in that direction through their investment dollars. David, what would your approach be to implementing AI in companies and organizations?
So, speaking from the perspective of more from the Department of Defense, but having them work both with the private sector and academia, I think it really involves three major areas that are interrelated. The first, obviously, is taking the principles and putting them into practice, and I will return to that subject here in a minute. But in order to do so, the two other areas I think are most important. The first is expanding productive conversation between the stakeholders, right? You'll see it time and again. Sean mentioned it. A conversation that happens on the Hill, that happens at a conference, that happens at a colloquium, that the different organizations, in a sense, are talking past each other. Part of that is a bit of a misunderstanding of the roles, but also the motivations from each of the stakeholder groups, and that's just unproductive at best. Related to that, though, is a notion that every person needs to be educated about artificial intelligence. Right. So whether we're talking about how we rely on artificial intelligence for using one of these devices, to how it shaped the future, to again, weeding through a lot of the misinformation that's out there and sort of the overpromise. For the military, what does the youngest private all the way up to the secretary need to know relevant to her position so that she understands the promise, but also the risk and pitfalls of artificial intelligence? As Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of the Defense Innovation Board's members, said, majority of the American population has some very deep-seated concerns and fears about artificial intelligence, right? Some of that may be irrationally tied to science fiction or whatnot, but it needs to be addressed. And part of the reason it needs to be addressed is, a fear of not being represented. That my job might be replaced by an AI-enabled automatic system. And just, in a sense, an overall lack of understanding. If we are going to embrace this technology, then every person needs to be better educated about artificial intelligence, which then leads to the other piece about how to put principles into practice. So, again, piloted with what we did with DARPA is, can we take a system? For example, the Army has risk management as part of our processes. Let's expand the scope of that. Right, so we're not just looking at risk to the mission, risk to force, risk to project, but can we open the aperture, in a sense, of the scope to identify the risk throughout the process of ethical risks, legal risks, and risk to society? Document those, take the risk mitigation steps, have approval at whatever the appropriate level is. For example, if a question comes up about lethal autonomy in a system, or facial recognition, like you mentioned, Sean, then who in the chain of command should be the person who says, I'm willing to sign off on that risk because this technology is absolutely necessary to do our business, to defend the country, for example. And that process really builds on what we currently do, expands it a bit so that it doesn't become additionally burdensome, that we don't stifle the innovation that we want to have with academia and with industry, as well as the education for the entire population, so that they understand it could be part of the dialogue and discussion about moving forward. So very, very specific, but some more broader themes as well, I think, are important.
Right, very interesting. So your approach is really a kind of a generalizing view. Let's spread knowledge across society, and that will be the route to implementation. as opposed to sort of the view that I proposed at the beginning, which is let's give the power to the investors and let them push things one way or the other. So there are different routes available to us. From your perspective, what will work to make institutions and organizations responsible in the AI area?
I think it's hard to say because I think we can't be too prescriptive in a technology that's sort of ever evolving and at this stage of it. But I do have concerns with leaving it to investors, just because if you have a profit-centered motivation, that doesn't often lead to the best outcomes for everyone. But I do think what would need to happen is that we have something where all the stakeholders have some sort of piece, and we develop a framework that isn't overly prescriptive, but still gives us some similar to what we see in Europe, where some of the frameworks that are developed there gives us a set of guidelines or principles to operate within. And again, this is going to be partly motivated by what is the risk of the technology we're talking about, but then also taking into account that people, we talk a lot about trust. People are trusting, we're asking people to trust a system that's not human to make a decision that could impact their life in profound ways. So I think that we need to have some way to make sure we have consent, to have explainability, transparency, and then I know Branka mentioned accountability. And I think these are sort of all the hallmarks of any ethical system. But I think the way that we get there is by having sort of private-public interactions, education, as David said, but then also developing a framework that we can operate with and let the technology evolve in as well.
Right. I think that's a very good point. I will just quickly say in my defense, I don't think that investment is the answer to the exclusion of other things. However, it's my position that it's an effective contribution to this discussion and to this project. So here's an example of how investors can actually contribute to this discussion. A group that I'm working with at the Frankfurt Data Lab, we were asked to do an ethical review of an AI healthcare device. What this device does is very interesting. It takes your EKG and then measures those heartbeats and finds tiny patterns that no human eye could find, which suggests coronary disease. So they have this diagnostic possibility, which AI makes possible. But what they did not consider is the following. They did not consider that there's a high degree of false positive results. That is, they say there's something wrong, but there actually isn't. There is a kind of autonomy question in their device. That is, something that presumably helps people be healthy, have more vital lives and more freedom because they're healthy, can actually have the opposite effect if we have large numbers of people who end up getting a false positive reading. And so they could be living perfectly healthy and active physical lives, but they restrain themselves because they're afraid of what the AI has told them. So something like that is a kind of a way that you could take a philosophical, ethical evaluation to a company and then talk or form an ethical report about how their product works in terms of this one issue, autonomy, and show there are these different aspects to it. And so I think from an investment perspective, right, that helps bring a kind of transparency, Sean, that you're interested in, to the way these products work. So that's a thought. Sean or David, do you have further thoughts about how things might work from your perspective before we go to wrapping up our discussion?
Real briefly, James. I like what you're proposing. In the same way, it reminds me of some of the projects that I've worked on and also advised. But the issue becomes having enough subject matter experts, right, to be able to really help inform the design and development team, right, and along the way. So in a sense, in addition to having subject matter experts, I go back to the education piece. One of the things we piloted with the Joint AI Center was responsible AI champions, but basically it was an executive level course to look at the AI principles from each of the individual's perspective, function, and role. In other words, one of the individuals was head of HR, right? So where does she see the ethical principles coming into play? Someone was, from represented policy, another from a data science. Is the burden should all be on the data scientist and then also be able to provide additional ethical or legal lens to it? Maybe not. So you need, in a sense, I think, a combination of subject matter experts to do a review throughout the DevSecOps of developing an AI system. But you also need a better educated workforce from all the different function areas, right? Whether it's the project manager, whether it's the commander who's going to use it, say at the end user, to have a better appreciation of that the decisions that they make, right, will have ethical implications in terms of the design, but also the use of that product. I think until we get everybody involved with it, that not the sense of that, the lawyers will take care of that, or are you going to bring on an ethicist and she'll be the one who provides that review? No, I think it's, everyone needs to be able to raise the red flag throughout the process. And I'm pleased to see that a lot of the conversation seems to be shifting from can we do something, how do we do it, to should we do it? Now, again, that there may be a bit of wishful thinking, but I think the conversation has moved far enough along that in different sectors, we're moving to this question of whether we should have this technology solve this particular problem, or perhaps there's another way to do that. No. And so I think that those are some of the other aspects of it. We tried it. Having a large body of subject matter experts is just something that we can't have in all the different projects.
Very difficult. Well, Sean, I will give you the last word. What are your thoughts on where we've ended up this afternoon?
No, I think it's been an interesting discussion from several different perspectives. And I think, based on what we're all saying, we all sort of identified the need for trustworthiness. I don't think anyone says that that's unnecessary. And, in general, in the last few years, we've all sort of, both private and public, it seems to have reached a point where people agree that we need trustworthiness, we need human-centric review, and probably need it at every stage of the technology's development. I think what we're going to be dealing with and grappling with is how do we execute this and how do we do it in a way that's manageable for all versions of all sorts of this technology. But I think in the next few years, that's where the conversation will be, is do we have some sort of mandatory audits, or how prescriptive and what is the regulatory scheme around this? Do we trust private sectors to do it themselves? I think that's where we are. But I think for the most part, people have agreed that this needs to happen. It's just a matter of execution.
Okay. Well, we were just wrapping up, and Branka, you have reappeared. I will give you an opportunity because sadly were you aware of the fact, Branka, that you fell off the call? Branka? She's fallen off again. Well, I think we're going to have to say that we will wrap up. And I am James Brusseau at jamesbrousseaualtogether.net. David, where could people find you if they have further questions?
I could be reached at david.barnes@westpoint.edu.
Perfect. And Sean, where could people contact you if they would like to pursue you with further questions and thoughts?
Sure. They can always look on the internetassociation.org. I'm also on Twitter at Sean Perryman, BA.
Great. And because Branka is out of reach, she can be found at the AI for Peace. If you Google that, you will find her webpage and be able to contact her. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this panel, an enlightening, thoughtful panel, very diverse and interesting viewpoints from the Academy, from the Defense Department, from Washington, D.C., and from California. So very good. Thank you all.